When life gives you lemons, make lemonade. Or, when life gives you lemons, make grape juice and watch the world wonder how you did it. When life gives you lemons, plant a lemon tree. Use that tree to make an orchard. Make lots of money off this orchard, so next time you see life, you can say, thanks for the lemons. Life hates people who are grateful for its lemons. When life gives you lemons, be glad it gave you anything at all. When life gives you lemons, ask for a receipt so you can return them for oranges. When life gives you lemons, keep them, because hey, it's free lemons. When life gives you lemons, throw them back at life and see if life will make that same mistake again. When life gives you lemons, ask, where are all these lemons from? Actually, don't ask. You really don't want to know where life got all those lemons. When life gives you lemons, find someone whose life gave them a pool and throw a wicked pool party complete with lemonade. And when life gives you lemons, eat them. They're good for you. Life knows best. I love these sayings because there's so many different ways of looking at the same thing. Almost all of them are the way of making the best out of a bad situation. And that's the story we find ourselves in with the Israelites today. For a while, life was giving Israel not lemons, but just plain lemonade. It was coming down straight from heaven, complete with a cherry and a tiny little umbrella. They were cruising smooth. During the time of David and Solomon, there was unusually good weather in this region, which gave them good crops and a way of expanding the population, settlement, and trade. And during this time, there were three large groups that emerged from the Middle East. There were the Samaritans, the Israelites, and the Egyptians. The Assyrians. I typed that wrong. It's in this time that we start to see that other kingdoms are writing about the Israelites. So they've gotten so popular that other nations are writing about them and what their God is doing. Up until this point, we only have some vague references to these hairy shepherds that keep showing up with their God. But David and Solomon die, and everything goes very wrong in the nation of Israel. Up until now, the tribes have been united. There were 12 tribes from the 12 nations of Israel, and they had formed one huge nation of Israel with their individual tribes and pockets around. Well, after Solomon died, 2 tribes accepted his son as a king, and the other 10 did not. This caused a massive split in the nation. And the kingdom of Israel was up north. The kingdom of Judah was up north, and the kingdom of Israel was up north. The kingdom of Judah was down south. And the split would last long into Jesus' time. Do you remember the story of the Good Samaritan and how hated he was by the people? Well, he was actually a Jew. He was just from the nation of Judah, kind of the redheaded stepchild of the area. Israel didn't really consider their way of worshiping legitimate, even much later on in history. And this divide becomes very crucial to our story. When the Israelites were fighting among themselves, the Assyrians were busy rising to power. So these 2 nations of Israel were fighting, and the Assyrians were rising and rising and rising. And they began to conquer the land throughout what we now know as the Middle East. And the Assyrians weren't nice about it. Until this point in history, the political and military tactics were to go in and either completely wipe out the entire male population or to force the country to pay a tribute, which was a large tax. And if the conquering nation chose to rebel, then usually they were wiped out. The Assyrians tried a new political move, however, and this political move became very effective. They began to massively deport people from their homelands. They would send those closer to the Assyrian capital and send loyal citizens of Assyria into the cities that were newly conquered. And this was massively effective in destroying nations like Israel, who were so caught up in the idea of being a promised nation of God. Because they weren't in their land anymore. What did they have? Assyria attacks Israel and does this incredibly wise military move. And they send the Israelites into exile in Assyria. But they don't send everybody. They take the best, the brightest, the strongest, the educated. and they leave behind those who have something to be desired. Essentially, they bring everybody who could cause political upheaval into Assyria and leave home the people who are picking their nose. Thank you, choir. All of this happened around the year 722 before Christ. Judah, however, is left untouched. And this is because my favorite king, King Hezekiah. And this is an amazing story. When the Assyrians attack, Jerusalem in the kingdom of Judah shuts up shop. They lock down. They close up the city gates and don't let anybody in, don't let anybody out. And this is great. This is a great idea except for one problem. There's no natural water source that goes in or out of Jerusalem. It doesn't take very long to run out of water when you don't have any natural water sources in a desert. And so the Assyrians know that the people of Judah can only stay walled up for so long. And so they just settle in to wait them out. And King Hezekiah comes up with this plan. And he assigns 2 teams of people. And he has one of them dig from inside the city and one of them dig from just outside the city, kind of where the cliffs are. And they begin digging. And it's a massive engineering feat because they had to be within 1/5 of an 1/8 of an inch to get the water flow perfect. But they manage. And the 2 teams meet in the middle. And the water flows freely from outside of Jerusalem into Jerusalem. And if you go today, you can still swim in the pool where the water collects. But be careful because it's famous for pickpocketers. And so the tunnel is so well hidden that scholars actually thought it was a myth of the Bible until the 19th century when it was discovered. And when they followed the tunnel through, they found an ancient plaque on the wall of the tunnel that was inscribed by King Hezekiah himself, describing it as Hezekiah's tunnel. It kind of gives me chills thinking about it. I think that is so neat. And after Hezekiah's death, it appears his son becomes very, very scared. And unlike Hezekiah, he doesn't rely on God for his salvation, and instead strikes a deal with the Assyrians. Judah becomes a vassal state of Assyria. They're neither conquered, but they're sworn to be loyal to the Assyrians. And this works well for a while. Judah continues to gain power in this time. But what goes up must come down. And Assyria very suddenly collapses. It's about 150 years after they had taken over Israel. And this leaves 2 big powers in the area. They're the Egyptians and the Babylonians, and both of them are fighting to be top dog. And the current king of Judah recognizes if they're fighting each other, there's not much they can do with Judah. So they amp up security. They work on building better walls and building up the fortresses that the Assyrians made them take down, while Babylon and Egypt are fighting out. And if you think about it, in this time they didn't have tanks. They didn't really use horses or anything like that to travel across mass distances of land. So it took forever to travel from a place like Babylon to Egypt to fight it out. And so when Babylon becomes the victor, and they do, they win over Egypt, Judah decides to send a message to Babylon declaring its independence. And Babylon is not pleased by this, and it begins a campaign to take over Judah. But it takes 10 years to do this, in part due to Hezekiah's tunnel. But the Babylonians do eventually succeed, and they are brutal about it. They do exactly what the Assyrians did. They bring the best and the brightest out and leave the nose pickers behind. And this is where the story of Daniel comes in. If you remember the story of Daniel, he's in exile in Babylon when he's dealing with King Nebuchadnezzar, when he's in the lion's den, when he's dealing with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. All of that takes place inside of Babylon, and that's in this time period. But Lisa will talk more about that next week when we do worship in the park. But in this time, the Babylonians also did the unthinkable. They destroyed Judah's temple. When they destroyed the temple, they exiled the kings, the priests, the scribes, and the prophets, which meant that the entire nation had an inability to worship. Because if you remember, worship had to take place with the Levite tribe. They had to be present for that. And after this, neither Judah nor Israel would ever be an independent state again until after World War II. Think about that. It's over 2,000 years. And even now that state is wrought with war and conflict. What strikes me about this story is how the decisions of a few leaders affected an entire nation. Not everybody in that nation was rebelling against God. Yet because of a few who were making choices, everybody received some pretty big lemons. And the prophets are full of stories like this. But what I also like about the prophets is that they are full of stories of people making lemonade. After the Assyrian conquest, but before the Babylonian exile, my favorite prophet Habakkuk prophesies. And this book is very short. It's only 3 chapters. But his words have hit home for me my entire life. The very end of the book, he writes, "Even though the fig trees have no blossoms, and there are no grapes on the vine, even though the olive crop fails, and the fields lie empty and barren, even though the flocks die in the fields, and the cattle barns are empty, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in the God of my salvation. The sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes me sure-footed as a deer, able to tread upon the heights." I'm going to say it one more time. And when I do, I want you to really picture what's going on here. And I want you to remember that these were people who lived off the land. They were proud of the land that God gave them, and it was being destroyed before their eyes. So close your eyes now and picture that. Even though the fig trees have no blossoms, and there are no grapes on the vines, even though the olive crop fails, and the fields lie empty and barren, even though the flocks die in the fields, and the cattle barns are empty, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in the God of my salvation. What do your empty vineyards look like? What are your blossomless trees? Take a minute and think about that. Fill it in for yourself. If you need help, look at Habakkuk 3:17 through 18 this week and fill it in for yourself. Maybe for you, Habakkuk looks like this. Even though my job is failing and I disagree with the nation's leaders, even though violence and disaster surrounds me and everything in life looks empty, even though the people I love die and my heart feels alone, yet. I love that word. Despite all of this, despite all of these bad things happening, I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in the God of my salvation. The sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes me walk by faith and not by sight. Through God, I can make it through this. I sat with a helpless woman one time, and she asked me how you find hope. And working in the hospital, I see people who have it, and I see people who don't. I see people who find miracles in everything, and people who find disaster in everything. But her question struck me. That if I'm supposed to help people, help the hopeless, how do you help people find hope? It was an odd question, and a few days later, I was talking it over with a dear friend of mine. This man is 56 years old, and he's slowly dying of ALS, which is commonly known as Lou Gehrig's disease. If you've never heard of it, this is an awful, awful disease that attacks your muscles. You very slowly lose the ability to walk, talk, write, swallow, and eventually to breathe. Right now, my friend can't talk, but instead communicates through typing on his iPad and has his iPad talk for him. But someday, very soon, he's going to lose this ability. And the only way he'll be able to communicate is through blinking. gives them a lot of time to think. And when we're together, we spend a lot of time talking about life, death, and hope. He tells me again and again that the most important thing in life is attitude. The other day he wrote that you see it in high school, beginning in high school with the most popular girl or the football star. And for the most part, they have very little special about them other than their attitude and their confidence. But this manages to carry them through life. And he reminded me that some of us have too little confidence and some of us have way too much. And some of us happen to find the right balance. And when we find that right balance of confidence, we find the ability to hope both in God and in our own abilities. Just like when you're learning to swim. We find the ability to laugh and to tell stories as a loved one dies. We say goodbye with hope. We find the ability to laugh in the face of a debilitating disease. To find joy in the people around us and what our role may someday be in heaven. We find the ability to believe that people around us will help us if we lose our job. We find the ability to hope that one day we may find sobriety. I understand that hope is expensive. It's probably one of the most expensive things on this earth, because the more you spend it, the less you have it, especially when there's no payout. But it can also be the most precious gift in the world. And we as a community, we as individuals, can help people to find hope. Or we can put a damper on it. We can be with Jesus helping people to swim, or we can be pushing people underwater. Yet, I will rejoice in the Lord. I will hope in the Lord. I will be joyful.